And welcome back. So in today's lesson we're looking at what was Elizabeth's religious settlements. That's one of our objectives. We're also going to try to understand how did it aim to please different religious groups in England. Now, we'll do things a bit differently. We're going to look at the task first of all, because you might want to take a pen and paper and make some notes as we're going along. Now your job at the end of this video is to create a leaflet or a poster that explains the religious settlement to the people of England. It needs to explain why it's being set up and how it hopes to bring together different religious groups and stop the fighting between the Catholics and the Protestants. It needs to explain what the Act of Supremacy is, the Act of Uniformity and royal injunctions, and also how it will be checked with visitations. Now, that probably means nothing to you yet because you've not been taught that before, but you will want to make some notes as we're going along to help you create your poster or leaflets. I don't mind how you do it. You could take a photograph of it and attach it into Google Classrooms, or you could attach maybe a Word document or a PowerPoint document into Google Classrooms. It doesn't matter how you want to do this, you can be very creative. This work is due in Sunday the 24th of May at 5 p.m. And as always, if there's any questions, please feel free to email me at gbrown@stopseyhighschool.co.uk. Okay, let's begin. Now, I've said this before, but religion is deeply important to people in Tudor England. When Elizabeth took the throne, religion is literally life and death to people. They believed they had to worship Christianity in a certain way to ensure they went to heaven when they died. And if they worshipped the wrong way, they would not go to heaven. Now, the problem is you've got different religious groups for Christianity. And they all felt their way of worship was correct and the others were wrong. And we've looked at two of these before, a constant theme, the Catholics and the Protestants. And I'm hoping if you looked at the picture there, you could work out which was a Catholic church and which was a Protestant church. That's right. The one at the top is the Catholic church, the colourful church. The one at the bottom is Protestant. It's more basic, it's more plain. Now, Elizabeth needed to find a way to solve this religious problem and unite the country. She realised that actually religion would cause issues, religion would cause rebellion, and she had to try to heal the country. Let's have a deeper look at the different groups that worship Christianity that she was trying to unite at this time. So first of all, the Catholics. And as you'll remember, England had been Catholic for centuries, until Elizabeth's father, Henry VIII, had made changes to religion in order to get that divorce. And the Catholics believed in things such as colourful churches to honour the glory of God, bright colourful robes, or as we call them, vestments, for priests to wear to show their importance. The Bible and the services of the church would be in Latin. The Pope was the head of the church. And there would be lots of decoration like statues and crucifixes in the church. Whereas, if we look at the Protestants, now England had been Protestant from 1534 to 1553. And Elizabeth herself was a Protestant. That's how she'd been brought up. And the Protestants said, no, you're worshipping Christianity the wrong way, Catholics. Your churches should be plain and simple, so you're not distracted from worshipping God. Priests are not special and they shouldn't wear special clothing. The Bible and the church services should be in the language of the country. So obviously in this case they should be in English. There should not be a pope, and statues and crucifixes are not needed in the church. That shows a complete difference there between the Catholics. They are two very different ways of doing things. And to make it more complicated, there was a third group, the Puritans. Now, these were extreme Protestants. They took things even further than the Protestants did. And a small group of Puritans came to England when Elizabeth took the throne. And they were hoping that Elizabeth would make England a Puritan country. What did they believe? Well, they said that the church should be basically almost empty and clear. We can see a picture there. That the Bible, yes, it should be in English, but it should be followed word for word. So, for example, when it says Sabbath day, Sunday is a day of rest, it literally means that you can't do anything apart from go to church. You couldn't travel around, for example. That priests should wear long black robes. That the people should be in charge of the church, not the monarch, not the Pope. And in church, it was a very serious affair. That meant things like no hymns, no music, for etc. Now, they are three very different groups here. And a key thing is it was impossible to please everyone. There was no way that Elizabeth could please all three groups here. Her best bet was to target two groups and try to bring them together. So which of these three religious groups do you think would Elizabeth not bother trying to please? Have a quick think. Well done if you said the Puritans. But why is this the case? Well, they were too extreme. They wanted too much to change. There is no way that Elizabeth could ever get the Catholics and the Puritans to accept the church. But also there was a smaller number of them compared to the Catholics and Protestants. It was really important to Elizabeth that she tried to bring together the Catholics and the Protestants. There was a huge number of people in England that were Catholic, but she also had to keep her own faith, which was being a Protestant. Elizabeth realised she would have to reach what we call a compromise. That's where you get two parties and they both make agreements. They both sort of agree on doing something they maybe don't want to do that will please the other side. So in this case, Elizabeth needed to create a Protestant church that had some parts to it the Catholics would be happy with. Elizabeth couldn't have just a completely Protestant church and that was it. There's no way the Catholics would accept that. She would need to find a compromise, a way of bringing in some Catholic parts to the church to make them happy. Now, Elizabeth called this her religious settlement, and the aim was to unite England under one church and not have it divided by religion. A compromise, bringing together the Catholics and the Protestants. That's the aim. And Elizabeth worked on this for months with her advisors, the Privy Council, who we looked at last lesson. Now, the fact that she worked on this so soon after she took to the throne tells us how important religion was. She realised she would need to try to unite England. They had to find a way to bring the Catholics and the Protestants together under one church. And this was the aim of the religious settlements, to heal England. And again, in your leaflet, you need to talk about the aim, so you might want to mention that here now and make some notes. Now, a year after she took to the throne in 1559, her religious settlement was announced, and it came in three parts. Part 1 is the Act of Supremacy. Now, Elizabeth was made Supreme Governor of the Church of England. Now, that's interesting. She could have said, I am the head of the Church of England, but she chose the title Governor instead. Why was that? Well, there was a few reasons. First of all, Henry VIII had made himself head of the Church of England when he had started to turn England Protestant. Elizabeth didn't want to seem the same as her father. The Catholics wouldn't like that. Also, the Catholics saw the Pope as being head of the Church. And this way, Elizabeth isn't trying to replace the Pope, she's given herself a different title. And the third reason is people were very sexist back then. They weren't comfortable with the idea of females being head of anything, let alone something as big as the Church of England. And Elizabeth was just pleasing people. Just by calling herself the governor instead of the head, it meant more people were likely to accept her. Very clever thing to do. She could have called herself the head of the Church of England. Instead, she just goes down a little bit. Governor, slight word change. It pleases people. Now, this meant that all members of the church, priests, bishops, we call them clergy for one word to unite them all, and the royal officials had to swear what we call an oath of allegiance to her. This swearing meant that they said they would do exactly as she said for them to do, and they would be loyal to her. They would not turn against her. Now, if your loyalty was ever in doubt after swearing this, you would be punished. And if you didn't swear the oath of allegiance, then you couldn't be a member of the clergy, you couldn't be a royal official. Elizabeth had to make sure that the people with her were completely loyal. Well, that's step one, the Act of Supremacy. Now she's got the people being loyal to her, she's got to make sure that everyone is giving the same church messages. How do you do that? Well, that's with part 2, the Act of Uniformity. Let's break that word uniform down. You wear one to school the whole time. What does it actually mean? Well, uni means one. Like unicycle is a bike with one wheel, for example. So uniform here means one form, one way of doing things, and everyone's doing the same, just like your school uniform. So a new book was introduced, and this was called the Book of Common Prayer. Every church in England had this. It was to be used in all churches, and it said exactly what should happen in church services. Priests had to read from this word for word. Elizabeth was telling priests what to say. They couldn't make things up as they went along, for example. But Elizabeth was very clever because the wording in the book was deliberately unclear. That meant that Catholics sitting in the church could understand the words one way, and they would be happy with this. They would say, actually, this is like it is in our Catholic religion. And the Protestants could read exactly the same book, exactly the same words, and they would understand things a different way. And they would say, okay, no, this makes sense. This is correct for our Protestant religion. So by making the words in the book quite vague, it meant the Catholics could interpret this one way, and the Protestants could interpret the same words a different way, and both groups would be happy with this. What else did the Acts involve? Well, it said priests needed to wear special clothing so they stood out. Vestments, we call these special robes. It also said that everyone had to attend church on a Sunday and holy days. Everyone has to do the same thing. And if you did not do this, then you were fined 1 shilling, which for most people would have been about a week's wages back then. However, if you were a rich Catholic, what we'd call a Catholic noble, for example, a shilling's nothing. You can give up a shilling, not a problem at all. You don't have to bother going to this new church. Now, think about this. Even if Catholics went to church and they worshipped how Elizabeth wanted 1 day a week, what could they do in the privacy of their own house? And the answer is that they could still worship in their Catholic ways. They could still worship, they could take Mass, they could still worship in Latin as well. Elizabeth would never know. Elizabeth was aware of this, but she just thought, you know what? I'm not going to check too harshly at this point. I just want to make sure that they are all in church, and I want to make sure that they are all following the services. The third part is the royal injunctions. And this basically means the new laws that must be followed by everyone. Let's have a look at these one at a time. So the first one is that all clergy, remember that's members of the church, must teach the royal supremacy. And that was that Elizabeth was in charge of the church. They must all have the same message. Everyone must say Elizabeth is in charge. Anyone who didn't go to church, their name must be noted down and they must be reported to the Privy Council so that they knew. Now, Elizabeth didn't check this too harshly to begin with. Elizabeth didn't want to punish people too much for not going to church. She was turning a blind eye. That's quite different from her sister Mary, who, if you remember rightly, in 5 years, was burning over 300 Protestants for not worshipping the correct way. Elizabeth is showing she's a bit different here. Every church, as we've seen, must have a copy of the Bible in English. You needed a license from the government to be a priest. Elizabeth doesn't want just anyone turning up in the church and talking about religion. It's got to be someone who the government have said is acceptable as a priest. They've sworn the oath of allegiance to Elizabeth. Now, I couldn't actually find a picture of this on Google when I was searching through. It wouldn't have looked like this. And for goodness sake, don't give me this as a leaving gift or anything like that. Okay, I don't want that cheap tap there. It gives you an idea. And you had to be able to produce this when asked. Just like a driving license today. The clergy were to wear special vestments, as we've seen already, to show that they were different. Again, clergy means church staff, people like priests. And Elizabeth said that images were allowed and that each church should display a crucifix. Now, there were some more points here, but I'm going to pause it here with these 6. And this is what I'd like you to do, the royal injunctions, these rules that must be followed. There's quite a mixture here. Can you just pause the video and think, which of these ideas would Catholics have liked? Which of these ideas do we think Protestants would have liked? You don't need to write anything down, but just have a look through. Try and see how Elizabeth has brought both groups together. Pause the video and have a go. So, which of the ideas Catholics have liked? Well, they're in red. They're at the bottom there. That the clergy were to wear special vestments, just like in the Catholic Church, colourful robes. That images were allowed, and each church should display a crucifix. That you had decoration in the church. And that meant when Catholics turned up to this new church, they would be able to see, actually, it's not so bad. There's a crucifix like we had in our church. The priests are in robes. There's some things here that I can get on board with. What about the Protestants? What would they have liked? Well, they would have liked the fact that the Pope wasn't in charge, and the fact that the clergy was saying Elizabeth was in charge of the church. They also would have liked the fact that the Bible was in English. It wasn't in Latin like the Catholics had before. They would have been comfortable with these ideas. So we can see at the bottom there, the religious settlement is a compromise between the two biggest faiths. It's the middle way, Elizabeth called it, trying to bring together some Catholic ideas, some Protestant ideas to unite England. But here's a question. Could Elizabeth just trust these rules to be followed and leave all of the clergy in England to it? How could she make sure people were doing as they were told? Pause the video and have a think about this. Okay, so let's use an analogy here. Now, sometimes in school, your teacher might give you a task and then leave the room for a few minutes. Can they trust you to do the task? Hopefully, yes, but the answer might be no. What could the teacher do? Just check on you, just to make sure after 30 seconds, just to make sure you're doing the task properly. Now, that's the same thing as, for example, the government have got for schools in England, where schools are told certain lessons to teach. They are told to make sure that pupils are learning, but the government doesn't just let schools get on with it. What do? They have inspections. They have Ofsted inspections, where schools are checked without much warning at all to make sure that the behaviour is good and to make sure pupils are learning. Now, Elizabeth set up something similar here. This was called visitations. And basically, from 1559, as soon as the inspections of the church, as soon as religious settlement came in place, inspections of the church and clergy took place as well. So Elizabeth was sending people to go to churches to make sure they were doing as she had said, to make sure that the Bible was in English, to make sure there was a crucifix in every church, to make sure that the priests and the other clergy members were wearing robes, to make sure that they were telling the people that Elizabeth was in charge of the church. So they would check for licenses as well. And let's look at this picture there, where it should say a service being conducted in Latin, not English. What if a member of the Privy Council walked in and they saw this happen during their visitation? Well, then the person would be in trouble. And look, it showed it was needed because in the first year, 400 clergy members were dismissed, which shows some members of the clergy were prepared to swear an oath to Elizabeth. I swear I'll do exactly as you've told me, and then just ignore that straight away. Now, these visitations happened every 3 to 4 years, roughly, as a result, just to check, just to make sure. And there wasn't too much of an announcement either. There was no real warning for people, so you never knew if Elizabeth's government was going to check up on you or not. Just some final thoughts then before we end this lesson. First of all, what does this religious settlement tell you about Elizabeth as a person? And think about what she could have done here. Elizabeth could have taken to the throne and said, I'm a Protestant, we're doing things the completely Protestant way, and if you don't do as I want, I will burn you like my sister did. She could have just gone and burned all the Catholics. She didn't have to try to make the churches more welcoming for them. She didn't have to make what we call concessions, these changes to her religion, to her faith to please people. And it's this idea about compromises. I don't want to turn this into a learn for life lesson, but think, would you have done the same if you were Elizabeth? because there will be times in your life where you need to make compromises with other people as well. Think about this. How would the Puritans feel about this religious settlement, and why? And there will be a video on this, Year 7. If you want to go and watch that, it will be on the YouTube channel. Year 10, this will be your video to complete after this lesson. What about the Catholics? Would the rich and powerful Catholics need to go to church services? Think about why or why not. With that shilling fine, would it affect them that much? And do you think the Catholics would accept these changes forever? Yes, there were some parts of the church service that they recognised, but a lot of Catholics would feel that actually they were going to go to hell when they died unless they were worshipping in a completely Catholic way. Maybe worshipping secretly at home might help with that, but it wasn't a good, what we'd call a long-term solution. So let's go back to this task then. So your job is to create a leaflet or poster that explains what the religious settlement was. Again, it needs to explain why it's being set up, how you're hoping to bring together the different religious groups, how you're hoping to unite the Catholics and the Protestants and stop the constant fighting. You need to explain the Act of Supremacy, the Act of Uniformity, and the Royal Injunctions. And I'm hoping they make a bit more sense to you now than they did at the start of the lesson. The Act of Supremacy. Members of the clergy having to swear to Elizabeth that they would be loyal to her as governor of the church. The Act of Uniformity, the fact that every church, didn't matter where you went in England, would be reading from the same book, the priests would be wearing the same clothes, and the churches would look the same as well. And the Royal Injunctions, those laws, for example, the Bible being in English, the crucifix in the church, the fact that the priests would have to wear those robes or vestments. And the final one, explain how it would be checked with the visitations. Explain that Elizabeth would be sending people to check on churches at random. What would happen if you couldn't produce your license to preach? What would happen if you were conducting a service in Latin? How much trouble would these people be in? Okay. So, a reminder guys, that work is due in Sunday the 24th of May at 5 p.m. If there's any questions or feedback that you've got on today's lesson, gbrown@stopsleyhighschool.co.uk. Thank you very much as always. I'm really looking forward to seeing what you can come up with here. Please make sure you're looking after yourselves, guys. Make sure you're getting fresh air, exercise, and take care. And I will see you next week. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.